Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 733rd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Lee Stringer, Allison Tamarkin Poller, Alex DeFrancesco, Ruth Weiner, and Cole Swensen. We are thrilled to welcome, and
Dan
Simon. We're also thrilled to welcome Nana-Ama Danquah here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Dan Simon is the founder and publisher of Seven Stories Press. He's the author with Jack Hoffman of Run, 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 The Lives of Abbie Hoffman, and translated Van Gogh Self-Portraits by Pascal Bonafoux. Lee Stringer is the author of Breakout, Seven Stories Press memoirs, Grand Central Winter, Stories from the Street, among others. Stringer is a two-time recipient of the Washington Irving Award in 1998, Murray Kempton Journalism Award, and 2002 Lannan Foundation Writing Retreat. Former editor of and columnist for Street News, his essays and articles have since appeared in many notable publications. Allison Tamarkin Poller is the web manager for Seven Stories Press. She lives in Ridgewood with her partner, her cat named Soup, and her dog named Snake. Alex DeFrancesco has published fiction and nonfiction in the Carolina Quarterly, the New Ohio Review, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. In addition to their story collection Transmutation from Seven Stories Press, they've published multiple other books, including the forthcoming Breaking the Curse. They are the winner of a Sundress Academy of the Arts 2017 Outspoken Contest for LGBTQ+ writing, and a finalist for the Cosmonaut Avenue Inaugural Nonfiction Prize. Their storytelling has been featured at the Fringe Festival, the Heart Podcast, and elsewhere. Ruth Weiner has worked at book publishers Farrar, Straus and Giroux and Henry Holt & Co. as a longtime freelance publicist and consultant for many other authors. In true indie press fashion, she wears several hats at Seven Stories Press, including publicity director and publisher of the children's imprint Triangle Square Books. And finally, Cole Swensen, our host, is the author of 17 volumes of poetry and a collection of critical essays. A former Guggenheim Fellow, she has been a finalist for the National Book Award and has been awarded the Iowa Poetry Prize, among other recognitions. She's also translated over 20 volumes of poetry and prose. And we're so grateful and honored to have you all here with us today to talk about the amazing Seven Stories Press. For more information on all these amazing speakers, check the link in the chat. And I'm going to pass it over to Alex now to get us started with the read.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am going to be reading from my collection Transmutation, which came out in 2021 from Seven Stories. And this particular story is called The Wind, the Wind. And it is a retelling of a French partisan song. And in it, there are four characters who represent the major demographics killed in the Holocaust. And each one of them is carrying a monster. So this is the very end of that story. The madman's monsters came in the night. He let us call him that because his monsters had always called him worse and he had become immune. He was still breathing when they came closer. They huddled beneath the trees, all wet wings, dripping hair, open mouths. Their mouths appeared to chant, though I could not hear them. Only he heard them, as he always had. I don't know if they chanted his suicide, but his knife flashed silver at his wrists and his blood was an oil slick in the dirt. The dogs were close, the men were close. I could not bury him. I did not have the strength. So we walked. And they touched me one after another, the hand of clay, the long yellow nails with earth beneath them, the claws that rent the skin of my arm. I wondered who would carry me as the howling came closer and the torch fire winked with the night stars. My monsters had been amorphous, my history is burned. I wondered if I could claim protection from a fine ghost in a black riding coat, a moon boy sold to a fate he never chose. I thought of the woman who had brought us meat and bread and cheese. I thought of wine dribbling from our lips like blood as we wept, and also of her face destroyed by a bullet, the hole of blackness, the well of blood, and I wondered if her spirits could carry me. My vision tunneled as I walked in the dust clouds. There were only the monsters and me, the companions I had found one at a time with whom I had tried to stop the advance, runaways, escapees, the brutally damned, the unchosen, the cast out. My vision hurled itself to the margins, and I wept and washed away the world. And when I saw again, I saw myself in a shawl holding a cane. I was an old woman practicing my old woman magic on the empty fields, calling the wolves and the bears to circle. And the monsters and the bears and the wolves and those mad with frenzy, we turned. We saw the dogs cower and the torches fall and the wind blow through the graves. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. We're going to have another reading now from Ruth.
Great. Thank you so much. This is so great to be here and for you guys to have us. So just by way of introduction, a few years ago, in the midst of Trump's border laws, when we were seeing children separated from their parents and immigrants and refugees being vilified on a daily basis on TV, and also communities welcoming new members from other countries and kids watching all of it and experiencing it. Into that insanity, we published an anthology of poems about leaving and arriving, about being accepted and rejected, about homelands lost and found. And I'm going to read one of the poems from that book, which is called Ink Knows No Borders. And got to get this in front of me. Here is Muslim Girlhood by Layla Chatty. I never found myself in any pink aisle. There was no box for me with glossy cellophane like heat and a neat packet of instructions in 6 languages. Evenings, I watched TV like a religion I moderately believed. I watched to see how the others lived, not knowing I was the other. No laugh track in my living room, no tidy and punctual resolution waiting. I took tests in which Jane and William had so many apples, but never a friend named Khadijah. I fasted through birthday parties and Christmas parties and ate leftover tagine at plastic lunch tables, picked at pepperoni from slices like blemishes, and tried not to complain. I prayed at the wrong times in the wrong tongue. I hungered for Jell-O and Starbursts and margarine, could read mono and diglycerides by 5, and knew what gelatin meant, where it came from. When I asked for anything good, like Cedar Point or slumber parties, I offered a quick inshallah. As in, can Jordan sleep over this weekend, inshallah? Peeking at my father as if he were a god. Sometimes I thought my father was a god. I loved him that much. And the news thought this was an impossible thing, a Muslim girl who loved her father. But what did they know of my heart, or of my father who drove 50 miles to buy me a doll like a Barbie because it looked like me, short brown hair underneath her hijab, unthreatening, breasts and feet flat enough to carry her as far as she wanted to go. In my games, she traveled and didn't marry, devoured any book she could curl her small, rigid fingers around. I called her Amira because it was a name like my sister's, though I think her name was supposed to be Sarah, that drawled A, so like sorry, which she never, ever was.
Thank you so much. Both those readings, I think, have just got us off to a great start. And so we'll move into the conversation. In our waiting time, we had some great stories going. So I think we'll be getting into some really great anecdotes and colorful little passages. But let's start. I'd like to start, Dan, by talking a little bit about your philosophy the philosophy that directs the press. And in particular, I was interested in your mentioning your interest in kind of toughness mixed with sentimentality. And I thought that was a really interesting mix, and I'd love to hear more about it.
So I was just thinking, listening to, I guess, the readings. I think there's a kind of, a prejudice in our society that says that the kind of storytelling that, is in some way directed at making the world better, or calling attention to things that need to be addressed. And I mean, in a way, Ruth's reading did it in one way and Alex's in a different way, that somehow that's a lesser form of storytelling. And I think the truth is really the opposite. The truth that we're kind of part of at Seven Stories is you can do something that is very real world and very much a kind of deep dive into the imagination that is going to give you just the best storytelling. Like the best storytelling is not divorced from the things we deal with in the world and as people living in the world. It's not turning away from that towards some kind of entertainment. It's really digging into that. And you and I were talking about Algren, and I want to get back to Algren, but Vonnegut was really the teacher of that too. It's like Vonnegut was really good at looking straight in the eye of terrible, terrible things and kind of saying, such that you would say, wow, this is so much better than what I used to do, which is stuff it under the bed and put it in the closet and lock the closet door and put furniture up against the closet. Kurt Vonnegut was all about, when you face things and talk about them, whether it's his experiences in Dresden or his mother's suicide or what have you, on Mother's Day, that as terrible as these things are, it's just better than any of the alternatives. And I think that's foundational for us. In terms of Algren, Algren was this weird paradox, this combination of, creating characters who were deep in the kind of belly of the beast of America, really like people who were not faring well in American society. And this was, especially in the late 40s and the 50s, where America was all about doing well. And Algren was falling in love with these characters who were really not doing well, and were not necessarily even honorable, and yet he brought to them because he was honestly really he was both really, there was a roughness and at the same time the sentimentality. And Algren said it, and he believed, and he says, you can't get good poetry, you can't get good writing without poetry in it, without a kind of sentimentality, he said, in it. And again, that's the kind of thing, like, we assume sentimental is kind of a step down from the best in writing, say. And Algren said, no, that's like, it's not how it is. It's more like if you can combine the toughness and the sentimentality and bring both of them, that's going to nail it. And so, there would not be a Seven Stories without these kind of, without Algren, and with that history. And then I was thinking just now, but maybe I should stop. But I'll just, next chance I get to talk in this conversation, there's such a connection between Algren, which is our early history, and Annie Ernaux, who's been our history all this time too. Both of them outsiders, and both of them, in different ways, doing this kind of, having this totality, which is both, kind of harsh in a certain way, and at the same time, soft in a different kind of way.
Yeah, great. I'd love to come back and hear more about all of that. I would love also to hear other people, Alex, Lee, Nana-Ama, what do you think about sentimentality and storytelling? What's essential what do you feel is essential to make a story go? Maybe we'll start with you, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me personally, that one of those last lines that I actually just read about, like, the outcasts and the people on the margins, those are not only in life my people, but also on the page my people. And to have sensitivity for people that society has kind of pushed to the sides is a really important thing to me in what I write and also in what I read. And yeah, I mean, just what Dan was saying about how people kind of overlook that sentimentality is really true. But I don't think you can write about hard things without having a necessary soft place. And I think that comes in there a lot.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, when I was listening to Alex read, I got that Hemingway, that kind of Hemingway toughness, that the death, there was no sentimentality when she's talking about the death. You know, he died, the coffin was this, and it reminds me of To Have and Have Not, when he's talking about the guy on the boat, and he says he died without any sentiment. But then again, as the story goes along, there's a counterpoint to it. And I think what we're really talking about is point counterpoint, because life is duality: good, bad, yes, no, up, down. It's the basis of all this thing we're doing electronically is that binary thing. It's about choices, and it's about being between two things and going this way and going that way. So you can, I don't think, have an honest voice without those two things. I think it's always a time to be tough and hard, but you have to have a heart, or else you're just complaining. So I agree with that. The other thing is, I was once on a panel, and the old lady read, well, we have something to say, but we must entertain. And I was just 6 months out of being ever published. So I was a little arrogant, but I said, well, I really don't do that, because when I try to entertain, I get too cute. And then I have nothing. But what I try to do is engage people. And those are the places where you gauge people. You go to the hard parts, you go to the soft part. What else is there? So
I was also intrigued by the centrality of memoir to Seven Stories. And I know that both of you engage with memoir, and I'm wondering about the line between the strict telling of what happened and an embellishment that might carve it into more of a story arc. Can either of you speak to that? Lee, I can see.
Yes, I think that's a mistake a lot of people make, the word embellishment. It's memoir. It's how you remember the past. That's the key. It's not autobiographical. It's not news reportage. It is of a sort, but it's you revealing yourself through the way you look at the road you've traveled. That's what a memoir is. So there is no embellishment in that sense. There is how you feel and what you, as you're writing it, what you come to understand of it. That gives it a structure sometimes that life doesn't have, but literature does. So I would put that out there.
Yeah, really well said. Do you want to add anything to that, Alex?
I would say I agree fully. And I would also say that the only thing memoir can do is tell your version of the truth. The truth is a big thing. And the truth has lots of different versions. And you can tell yours. And something I'm also really interested in memoir is speculative memoir, in which I think, like, a really great example of it is there's this one story that I had read that the woman writing it imagined her mother on the day she died and what that day was like for her mother. Now, obviously, she would have like no idea, not being her mother, but through the place of speculative memoir, which is still a contested place, I think we can actually explore some of the things you're talking about too, Cole, where it's not so much embellishment, but also just imagining the lives of other people sometimes.
Yeah.
I do see every now and then memoirs that are written because the person has a famous name and people will read it. And there's a temptation sometimes in those memoirs to dress up the past as a story in a story form that's, you can tell you're like aggrandizing it to fit a kind of story format, like Hollywood, beginning, middle, heroic, end, and blah blah blah. And I can see those as being a little troublesome, because I think it undermines what you can really do in a memoir.
Mhm.
It undermines your right to complete integrity, to who you are and what you care about.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
try to squeeze it into a formulaic structure, I think that's a self-betrayal.
Yeah.
And
Dan, I'd like to ask you about how you balance the different genre in the press, and how you make choices of whether you're going to go for fiction, memoir, nonfiction at any given moment.
Well,
Well,
it's easy.
it's really evolved over the decades. I know that when we started out, I was always like, nonfiction politics is like way over here, and that fiction and literature is way over here, and there was a kind of firewall in between them. And I know that personally now, I just feel completely the opposite. It's like I'm less interested in genre. These are all works of the imagination. You have to, even if you're writing, history, and you're writing just what actually happened based on, and you're just, completely tied to events, you have to imagine it. You have to fully imagine it. I mean, great historians, you have to be able to really imagine it. And it so happens at Seven Stories that, for example, and I think this is consistent with what Lee and Alex were just saying, Nelson Algren was really big, on this. If the cell window had 5 bars, you could not say there were 4 or 6. Like, and he had this through, his most prized possession in a way was this really worn by the end, almost erased by the end, pass to the lineup in the Chicago precinct, which allowed him to go when they, did the lineup to see if a witness had recognized, any of the possible the people that they had who might have committed the crime. And so he got to go to that, and got to go to the, got in. And, he really prided himself that he didn't sit and make this stuff up, that it was based on his experiences. But then, again, the miracle of Algren is his characters are unique unto him. And Studs Terkel talked a lot about that. He created them out of what he actually saw and the real people, and kept it very close. And the things they said, expressions that have now entered the language, like, having a monkey on your back, and things like that. But yet they have this quality that is kind of in Algren. It's Algren's heart, where he lends them this dignity and this kind of respect. He treats them with such respect, and that becomes a big part of how he's imagining them. But so in the case of, again, I'm kind of, for some reason, thinking today, from Algren to Annie Ernaux, this ability to imagine what is, and then start from there. So the notion of kind of sitting down and embellishing is just kind of like, you can fill the space to bursting without that. And I think that's a little bit Seven Stories style. So I think memoir, and the reason probably, Cole, that you ask about memoir, is there's this kind of sense of a meeting place between literature and politics. I mean, like, Kurt Vonnegut did for us do the book that's in a way closest to his autobiography, A Man Without a Country, but all his books are kind of deeply fiction and deeply autobiographical. Everything. These are just little, these are kind of miracles. These are paradoxes and miracles.
Yeah, great.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I would contend that in the days we had our serious authors, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Norman Mailer, and people like that, I always recognize their novels as slightly edited reality.
Mhm. Yeah.
They all wrote out of that. All of them. They didn't sit around. I dispute wholeheartedly that writing is an act of imagination. It's an act of excavation. In my book, you don't sit and imagine things. Even if you can imagine a plot, you have to know something real to make that plot swim. So I always thought the great novelists of my era were just slightly edited memoirs, almost.
But there is something called the literary establishment, which looks at these things a little bit different. Like, we all agree with this, but Algren hated the New York literary establishment, and they hated him back, to be honest.
Really?
Yes, and Ani Ernaux was tolerated and by the way, loyally published by Gallimard for now really 50 years. It's an extraordinary fact. But always kept kind of at arm's length until so what Alex said about the outsiders, I mean, this is a very genuine and true thing at Seven Stories. I'm not saying we're unique in this, but it is kind of true that the people, the writers we work with, but also just people generally, that other people might look a little bit askance at, like, the kind of people, whatever, that the literary establishment, let's say, that's a convenient boogeyman, that there's nobody here from the literary establishment, so I can just use them as our enemy, ideological enemy, which they're great people inside the literary establishment. They're great people at corporate houses. So it's not a people thing, but the literary establishment, let's say, the people that they might say, no, I don't think so, are not just the people that we let in. They're, like Alex was saying, the people that we think that we put on the highest plane, the people that we admire the most,
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Maybe let's take a turn and think about what goes on behind the scenes, because I feel like we have the opportunity to have both Allison and Ruth here, who are doing things that are less visible than the books that come out. And so I'd love to hear, Allison, let's start with you, and just tell us what it looks like from your perspective, running what you do. And
Sure. So I actually wanted to kind of go back to what Lee and Alex and Dan were talking about with regards to memoir and fiction versus nonfiction, and the meeting of the political and the literary. And kind of it all comes down to creating a narrative and seeing how that narrative can be accepted or understood by the audiences that you're attempting to reach. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do as the web manager. So I'm all about trying to meet people where they're at, but at the same time, try to challenge them or present ideas in a way that is slightly challenging or might kind of disrupt any preconceived notions that someone might have. And I think that our books do that a lot. And I think that that's one of Seven Stories' strengths. And so, yeah, my job, I think, is trying to convey that in as clear a way as possible.
great, yeah. How about you, Ruth? You do a number of things.
Well, I'm also going to jump off that previous conversation, because I think there's not just a sort of human instinct, but a commercial, marketable need to categorize. People want to think into, what is this? Is it a memoir? Am I reading the truth? What really happened? Or is this something that's completely invented? So on the one hand, it's the reader, the librarians, the booksellers, their heads kind of explode when there's ambiguity. And I happen, so wearing my hat as the publisher of the children's division imprint, I love that ambiguity. I love that place. Like, where am I? And just that you can find a place that's speaking truth to the reader. So, as when you're behind the scenes publishing the book, it's like you want the book to tell the truth, but be it whatever it is. On the marketing side, where Allison and I also live, when I'm wearing my publicity hat, people want to know, like, what are you telling? What is this? And I think Seven Stories and Triangle Square are both so great because they push back against that a lot of times. Ani Arnaud, we keep talking about Ani Arnaud. A lot of what her books are nonfiction memoir, but she never wanted it to be called memoir. Dan, you can jump in and disagree, and Dan knows her better, but everybody wants to call it a memoir. And if you don't call it a memoir, what do you call it? We live and die by these BISAC codes, and people's heads explode when they don't know how to categorize a book. Is it fiction or is it nonfiction? So we're publishing Ani, and we kind of put BISACs in together. Like, we mix them up, and people are like, you can't do that. Then we don't know where to shelve the book in the bookstore. I understand there's a practicality that people have to live by. But, and we have another collection coming out in early of 2024 by this Ukrainian writer who's actually fighting on the front lines right now. And it's a collection of stories, but the stories are fiction and nonfiction as he describes them. And they're just sort of merged together. You don't know that one story is fiction and that the next one is more of a journalistic work. They beautifully read together, and they, evoke this country that he loves. And so does it matter? But so on the one hand, we're forced to say, but on the other hand, maybe it doesn't matter.
If I can just, one of the things that it ends up being about, this question of factuality and fiction, nonfiction, is respect for the reader, Cole. And so, one of the things that is kind of, it's part of our kind of persona. It's also, I think, deeply true, is this idea of looking up to the reader. So, I think it's, when we launched the kids line, it's like we look up to kids, which was a little bit different philosophically, but, Howard Zinn, who we publish not all, but many of Howard's books. And it was this idea that, assume the reader's smart and that they can get it, give it to them, like, look up to them. And it's such an important philosophical foundation for us because, it's very different. There's a lot of, I'm the expert, I know, you don't know, looking down at readers, and it can happen in different ways. It can happen by approaching storytelling formulaically, for example. The book is like that other book, and all these are kind of subtle ways of insulting the reader, frankly, to me. And I'd like to think we don't do that. So a lot of this question of, it's like the larger truth. If you're trying to manipulate the reader, they're kind of being lied to in a certain sense. If you're trying to manipulate them, it's like, I know the answer, I'm trying to get you to think what I think, sort of thing. Whereas it's possible to approach readers in a much more open way and say, okay, yeah, I'm the author. It means a certain thing to me. It might mean something different to you. You get to have your own ownership of it. And I'm thinking, we have, again, in the Triangle Square list for kids, we're doing this series called They Said No. And it's a form that actually the French are better at than we are. And it is called historical fiction. And you can read, and we don't call them biographies, it's historical fiction, but there's one on Anna Politkovskaya, there's one coming on Rosa Luxemburg, there's one that we've just released, I think, on Harvey Milk, or it's about to come out. Conversations are made up. But there's such attention to the historical, factualness that these writers are able to make things up in that case, as different from, some of what we were talking about earlier. But there's this, again, this looking up to readers, this deep entrenchment in the facts of that person's life, Harvey Milk's, Victor Yara's, whoever it might be. And, so at the end of the day, I think it almost becomes more about this question of looking up to the reader, of not trying to tell the reader what to think or feel, let them have their own ownership. That almost becomes more important than whether you embellish or make things up or not.
Yeah, that's really well put. Thank you. I
Can
know.
I piggyback one quick thing on that? Because he also does it to the writer. And one thing I know that been a godsend, I would never be published if I hadn't gone to Seven Stories Press, because he wasn't, at no time the Seven Stories Press tried to get me to write the book they wanted written. And I realized that I was asked to write because they liked what I was writing, that it was important. And as for fiction, nonfiction, James Baldwin said, writing is the art of laying bare truths that are hidden by the facts.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great quote. I know we've got some images to look at that sort of tell the story of the press from a visual angle. So maybe, Eleanor, we can go into that. And if we could just get kind of captions by anyone who'd like to give them so we know what's going on.
This is the day of our holiday party.
Okay.
It's the New York-based staff. So we do have staff that since COVID are scattered, but this is the New Yorker.
Right. So this is about half the staff. In fact, the people that are New York based and are coming back into the office some of the time. And as Ruth notes, where the rest of the staff is so remote, we couldn't call them back even if we wanted to. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So any or no plan to come to New York the week after the Nobel was announced, unbeknownst to, it was planned long before the Nobel. And she came and she visited, here she is visiting our office with Howard Zinn in his party hat in the background.
Wow.
And it was great. It was great.
We have our priorities clear, which is Ani had time to come to the office and have sandwiches with the staff as a top priority.
This was the day she was in, oh, sorry, Allison, go ahead.
No, it's quite all right. This is when Annie spoke with PBS out of our office, which was very exciting.
You can't see us squatting in the background, hiding from the camera.
So, Gary, Indiana, I mean, these are his first two novels, which we reissued with new introductions by a couple terrific younger writers and intellectuals, Toby Hazlett and Sarah Nicole Prickett. And then this past year, we did his kind of, a collection of essays over a 30-year period. They got a lot of attention. And, so again, Gary, Indiana has stood for so much in terms of the counterculture and great writing, both fiction and nonfiction over the years. So it's been great to be part of Gary's kind of rediscovery moment.
And here's from another holiday party that we did with a little book tree.
The office.
The office.
As it was through most of the pandemic without people. And that's a little portrait of Barbara Seaman, who's a really important figure for Seven Stories. Barbara was one of the most important figures in feminist health journalism. It's really thanks to her that there are health advisories on pills, that Congress passed that legislation. She was a great advocate for women and especially for young women writers, and brought a number of young women writers to Seven Stories over the years.
That's Charlie. Charlie's our house mascot. And the fox is his mascot.
There's a lot of our best ideas come from Charlie these days.
Wow.
More office.
Oh, and there's Lee.
Oh, yeah, there's me with Kurt Vonnegut.
There's
Oh,
Lee.
no.
There's Lee with Kurt. We introduced Lee. I introduced. I did a very. I tell you how sneaky I am. I sent Kurt Vonnegut back in 1990.
98.
97, a bound galley of Lee's book. And I said to him, very dishonestly, really, I said to him, Kurt, I'm not asking you to do anything for this book. Just read it. Just read it. And he groaned. And he read it, and then he became this crazy fan of this book. I had outsmarted him. If I had said, could you write a blurb? Could you, become an advocate for Lee? I don't know what he would have said, but I said, I'm not asking you to do anything, just read it. And then he started sending me faxes saying, you've discovered the new Jack London. You're going to make $1 million. He then became just this incredible advocate for this then unknown guy who had been a homeless person. And the thing I'm very proud of, Lee, I can say, you probably heard me say it before, but with a lot of help from Kurt at that first moment, but we never published Lee as a homeless guy who wrote a book, which other folks have done. We always published Grand Central Winter as the birth of a writer. It was always about, this is an important literary talent. This is the first of many books. He's a writer. And we still, as Lee, you would say, the kind of talking dog story.
Right. Yeah.
Those stories did still appear, the homeless guy, blah, blah, blah. And you kind of assume they're going to be back homeless again before long. But over time, we succeeded in our goal, which was not to have it be about a homeless person, to be about a writer. And that was always, very clear in our minds in terms of, the cover design, the editing, and that we did. Everything was kind of low key. The title, Grand Central Winter Story, subtitle, I think, was Stories from the Street. But everything about how we presented Lee was kind of looking up to Lee and this book is the birth of a writer. And I think we mostly won that in the media.
I think we did. Should we do a very quick tour around that wall just while we're there, so you can see the red framed photograph is of Nelson Algren.
At the racetrack, unpublished photo.
But taken by the great Chicago photographer Art Shea. Below him is Subcomandante Marcos.
Taken in the Sierra Madres, again, an unpublished photo. It came from from our friend Allen Ginsberg's collection.
Wow.
In the center is a framed piece of cardboard, from Occupy Wall Street.
It's a pizza box. It was on the ground at Occupy, and we kept it and framed it. I think it's beautiful. If you can't read it, it says Occupy All Streets.
And then I wouldn't do everything, but just to the right of that on the top are the famous graphs that Vonnegut created. And we have them and some other art by him in the office, which is really special.
And he tried to get a PhD from University of Chicago with that work, which was identifying the kind of basic story in Western society, as if, comparable to any other primitive society. Underneath that actually is something that came from the Book and Rail's very own Fong Bui. That's a Seton Smith diptych, which came to 7 Stories from one of the Brooklyn Rail auctions. And underneath that is Phil Jackson and Charlie Rosen coaching together at the Albany Patroons in the CBA, Continental Basketball Association. And we've done many books by Charlie, and we did a book called More Than a Game by Phil and Charlie together. Next to that is Lee Stringer and Kurt Vonnegut at lunch after they did an event together some months after, and the event together with this lunch became a book that we published called Like Shaking Hands with God, which is kind of by both Kurt and Lee. It's a beautiful book on the art of writing called Like Shaking Hands with God. Next to that is the very first thing that 7 Stories had in the world was well, there were two things. Before we had any desks or computers, we had this painting of a drawing of a sunflower by Kathy Quinlan, wonderful artist. And then at the very top there
I
is,
never knew where that came from. That's
yeah, the first thing we had, that in the rocking chair. And then at the very top is Johnny Cash together with Bob Dylan backstage in the early 60s at Carnegie Hall. And Bob is kind of coming up to Johnny Cash basically as a fan for an autograph. And it's a triptych by the photographer Jill Kremens, who was Kurt's wife. And it had been commissioned by Bob Dylan's wife. And then she wanted a bigger one. So Jill called and offered it to us. And it's a great historical moment. And then on the far left is two works by the artist Moira Davey. The one of the two big dictionaries is called Two Fat Ladies. And then she has done a lot of photographs of books. And Moira is now artist collected in many, many museums around the world, but at one time was a publicist at Seven Stories.
Great.
And then on the upper right is a Harvey Pekar. I'm sorry, but once Ruth started us on this map, this is my dog and pony show. At the top on the right, Harvey Pekar, images of Harvey's face, and Harvey was, obviously a great graphic novel memoirist, and worked with different artists. And this is a collection of the different artists that he worked with. And his wife Joyce Brabner gave that to us after Harvey passed.
It's great to see these up close. The graphs are beautiful.
The what?
Oh, the graphs. It's just really nice to be able to see the graphs up close.
Nice. There's Amy Goodman with Ralph Nader, Chris Hedges. We publish a lot of Ralph's books and just did our first book finally with Chris this year, which is a book called The Greatest Evil is War, which I commend to people. It's, there isn't really an international peace movement yet, but there are little stirrings and very little that's published. So you can read everything that's published right now on peace with just a few volumes. And Chris's book, The Greatest Evil is War, is a terrific one. And I would also commend to you a book by Medea Benjamin from Or Books, which I think it's called something like The History of the Iraq War, of the Ukraine War, of war in Ukraine. There's Tom Hayden and Juan Gonzalez from Democracy Now!
And this is Kia Corcoran signing at the Strand of her first novel that we published called oh my gosh, what's it called?
The Castle Across
the Magnet Carter. Thanks. And then we've since published another novel of hers, Moon and the Mars. She's wonderful. She was in conversation here with Robin D.G. Kelly, and just delighted to speak with all of her fans. This is a great one. So we published Corey Silverberg's trilogy for kids on sex ed. And the first one is called What Makes a Baby? And for an event we had, Corey had made up these, plush stuffed animals of a sperm and an egg, of course.
This is a tattoo artist, Freddie Negretti, who really originated the black and gray style of tattooing. And this is Freddie with us at an industry event called Winter Institute. And Ruth and I both looked dazed because Freddie just flew in, but Ruth and I have been like working it for, several days at that point. But Freddie's a terrific artist. And, I really appreciated getting to know him.
And a lot of his tattoo influences are Oaxacan and Aztec, Mexican, Mayan. And I just had an opportunity in the midst of this crazy meeting to go to the Denver Art Museum with him, which I highly recommend if you ever find yourself in Denver. They have an unbelievable collection of Mayan and Aztec pottery and art, and it was quite incredible to walk through it with Freddie. He has so much knowledge of it, so that was kind of fun.
Freddie again, that's his book.
This is Julia Alvarez signing her children's book called Where Did They Go?, which was illustrated by, I'm going to forget her name, but she's a very famous Vermont landscape artist. If anyone remembers her name, please, because this is terrible. But again, at an industry meeting, but Triangle Square has been publishing a lot of these kind of one-offs, children's books by adult authors. Julia happens to have published many other children's books in addition to her really wonderful adult books. But this was the first one of hers, first and only that we've published so far.
This was a national bestseller because it came out right around the beginning of Bernie's run, first run for president. And Ted Rall, who's a political commentator, and we have done with Ted this series of graphic novel biographies. And, you know, he's a wonderful artist and astute political observer. And this was, you know, we had some participation from the senator. He spent an afternoon with Ted, which, you know, helps. But again, this is, you know, a very contemporary form of nonfiction that can have wide appeal and can be edgy and doesn't have to be boring. And you know, it's both visual and text. So, you know, again, these are just, this is not, yeah. So the, you know, the things we have images of are kind of
Very random.
I was trying to think of other words to say that. It's not, it's all important, but you know, it's not the most, you know,
Yeah. So, and for instance, this is quite old, but this is the Indian writer Uday Prakash. We published this really beautiful short story collection by him. Here he is at the Asian American Writers Workshop. That's Valeria Luiselli to the left, who is in conversation with him, and to his right is the translator. And I forgot who else is on the stage, but it was a great event.
Uday Prakash, a wonderful, wonderful Indian writer, and we just did the one book, but I commend it to you. It's a beautiful, and I had a great time. I was so happy to be publishing Uday's work because it really did remind me a great deal of Algren. And even though you know, Algren is, you know, safely in the American canon, you can't really imitate him. And, you know, there's not that much work that even on our list where I say, oh, this feels like Algren all over again. And I did feel that with Uday's work very happily.
Very nice.
But I wanted to say, Cole, you know, there's different challenges over time, you know, so Seven Stories has been around. If you combine it with the predecessor company, Four Walls, Eight Windows, you know, since the early, well, since 1984 or so. And, you know, there are really different challenges at different times to survive physically, but also, you know, spiritually. You know, you have to survive as who you are. And I'd say these days, you know, there's a lot of, you know, kind of paradoxical things. On the one hand, the American independent publishing community is something that we can be very, very proud of. You know, in general, there's no community of independent publishers in the world as strong as the American independent publishing community. A lot of that's due to the strength of the independent bookselling community. In other words, we're only as smart as our retailers. If we're doing brilliant books, but nobody can find them, then, you know, we're nowhere. So America has, you know, an incredibly resilient and creative American bookselling community. And thankfully, with a lot of young people going into it. It's a desirable profession, as difficult as it is. And I'd say the same thing about independent publishing. I'm not just blowing smoke when I say this is the best independent publishing community in the world. You look at companies, whether it's 7 Stories or New York Review or Feminist Press or Melville House or Akashic or Verso or Haymarket. There are just so many dozens that I could name. They're all true to their mission. Some are nonprofit, some are for-profit, but they do the books they ought to be doing. They're not, kind of in a, they're not corrupted in terms of just being sales driven. They're all trying to balance, survival and selling, but staying true to, to the mission. And then in this present moment, the challenges are, very complex and not always self-evident. There's some really destructive forces culturally in America and in the world, and you can't really, you can't say, I can prove this. Books are being degraded, but I can't prove that. Amazon is both the biggest bookseller in the world and also, part of this kind of lowest common denominator shift that's happening. And I'll just, because this is going from being a song to being, a moan or something. So I'll just stop by saying, if you look at the bestseller lists, you understand what I'm talking about. So the bestseller lists are dominated by Colleen Hoover, et cetera, and books that are nobody would claim are kind of creating a lasting legacy or elevating us in any way, et cetera. On the other hand, if you look at the awards, 7 Stories, Annie Ernaux won the Nobel Prize this year. New York Review of Books with Josh Cohen won the Pulitzer Prize, and on and on and on. And these aren't outliers. This is kind of the norm. So, the independent publishers are, not just because I say so, but are really kind of holding up the world in a certain sense. And of course, great work is also being done at big houses, but there's a sense where it's kind of like the sales and the profits are more steering towards the corporate entity, the kind of corporate, triad of kind of Amazon, big publishing, et cetera. And, the independent sector is doing something that is somewhat marginalized, but still thriving. And by the way, partly thriving thanks to the infrastructure created by the big publishers who've done us a great service by creating the infrastructure that they have.
But can I just add to that thriving also thanks to the thriving independent bookseller community, thanks to librarians, who are constantly talking about independent press books and also independent media. Thank you, Brooklyn Rail. It's because of publications, media, where people can discover books other than what's in, the Colleen Hoovers and the mainstream stuff. That's just those books just generate on top of one another. On itself, it's just, when it wins, it keeps winning. So it's great when there are other indie minds in bookselling library.
I'm so glad you're bringing out the notion of a network, a complex of integrated people, services, et cetera, that it's a very complex world that is, as you say, Dan, extremely successful, and thank goodness. This might be a good moment actually to open it up to questions from the audience and get comments and that sort of thing. So I'll turn it over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you everyone for such a rich and generous and exciting conversation. It's been such a joy. We have a question from Lynn Crawford in the audience. Lynn, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so much. This was just phenomenal. And I live outside of Detroit, and Detroit's a highly literary community, and we have wonderful independent bookstores, Bookbeat and Toad Vine and Pages. I could go on and on. I live in a town outside of Detroit where I took our kids to the library. I spent hours and hours there. I could always check out something wonderful. And I went to the library about 2 months ago, and it was all those books were gone. And they were all replaced by just what you said, by current bestsellers. There was no Virginia Woolf. There was no Ernest Hemingway. There was one James Baldwin. And I felt like I was walking into, I thought I was having a bad dream. And I'm wondering, you know, it was this total like bleeding of, and they had a beautiful book collection. And somehow there had been a decision made to make this very big, probably not inexpensive move. So we have exactly both what you're talking about. And I commend your mission and all of, because I'm not sure what libraries are. Anyway, do you know if that's a trend in libraries?
We're talking about libraries a lot these days. So, you know, the community of librarians is really powerful. And thank you, Ruth, for, you know, and Cole, you know, it is a community. We all kind of help each other. You know, librarians are really important. But what happens, I think, to kind of partly answer the question, because we have been talking about it a lot now, is library budgets have been cut. You know, a lot of librarians, like school librarians, a lot of them lost their jobs during the pandemic, but budgets have been cut. And apparently, you know, they feel under a lot of pressure to bring in those new, much more commercial books, which are quite expensive for them to bring in, but partly because people put holes on them, people request them. So I think you can go to your library and request the books that you want, and that does make a difference. Like, you know, we want librarians to make sure that, you know, all of our core titles and most important titles are available to people at their local libraries everywhere. And it's really hard to accomplish that. And what the librarians kind of tell us is that, you know, they have, you know, less funds, and that they'll get, you know, a great number of requests for the new Colleen Hoover or whatever it is, because that's what's out there. That's what people see and hear about. And they kind of have to do that because that's what their, you know, the community, the people who, you know, have library cards and are relying on the library are asking for.
Yeah, I mean, they're a little bit like your local government in a way. You know, they should be representing the community in which they, you know, thrive. So go ask them to carry books that you want to see.
Yeah, that's one of the best things you can do to support independent presses actually right now is to go into your local library or local bookstore and request that they order these books.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's actually especially important right now with all of the book bans that are going on in a governmental level. That is entirely affecting school libraries and public libraries. So if you want challenging literature that might not be necessarily what the powers be want you to be reading, but if you want to read that, you should make that known so that the librarians know that they have you on their side and that you are interested in these types of books.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you brought that up, Allison, because it's really a big thing that's happening. I'm sure you're all aware of the book bans that are happening around the country from and the pressure that librarians and teachers and school boards are feeling to not stock certain books, and several of ours have been targeted. But we really encourage all of you, and we try really hard to support those people on the ground, the teachers and the librarians who are they are personally being attacked. It's really crazy, but
can I just say something to add to that? Can you tell all of your friends to just get a library card? That's also something, because they don't get funding if people think, oh, well, you only have X number of people who even have library cards. So something as simple as that even helps.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
What a great question, Lynn. Thank you so much. We have a question from my colleague, Chloe, and if anybody else wants to ask a question, you can feel free to raise your hand or send a message in the chat. Chloe.
Thank you so much to all of you for this amazing conversation. It was really lovely to hear from each of you, and it was such a generous conversation. My question is, Seven Stories Press says of yourselves that you publish uncompromising political books, fiction, and poetry. And I wonder if you can speak to what you meant by uncompromising when you started the press, and if that meaning has changed over the years.
Yeah, I think it's constantly changing. But we have sweatshirts that say no middle ground. And so I think I mean, I might toss this to Allison, get ready, but to me, uncompromising is just, this is, I mean, I hope we're funny sometimes, but we're also deadly serious. I always think about, Bob Dylan's song All Across the Watchtower, and he says at some point, people may think, it's all a joke, but that's not how we are, and so it's kind of in that spirit, uncompromising. Allison, help me here.
Well, I think fundamentally we are a political press. Even our, not, as we were talking before, our fiction, our more literary titles are steeped in a political ideology that is broadly, I would say, leftist. With that, a lot of the ideals that we are espousing in our books are things that should not, as we were talking about yesterday in our rehearsal, are things that should not really be considered leftist issues. That social justice is not a leftist issue. It just happens to be that the left is the only one, or the only ones who care about that, or who want social justice to come to fruition. So I think that uncompromising it really does mean just kind of sticking to those ideals in whatever form they're going to be coming in. It's also worth talking about the kind of going against how Seven Stories, at least the way Dan has talked to me about this, is as a publisher, we are trying to publish books that kind of challenge preconceived notions of what literature or what political nonfiction should be doing at that given time. So one example that Dan has brought up before is Noam Chomsky's 9/11, Is There an Alternative? That was published in the month after the attacks on the World Trade Center. And it was kind of a look at the way that the United States had kind of created a situation that led to the September 11 attacks. Or right now with the invasion of the Ukraine, how there seems to be a kind of all hands on deck response where everyone seems to be very pro intervention, at least US intervention. And one of the things we've published recently, this book, The Greatest Evil is War by Chris Hedges, is kind of working as a counter to that, as Dan was saying before. And I do think, yeah, that most of the uncompromising, when we say uncompromising, it has to do more with kind of remaining not controversial, but it's kind of a publisher that is willing to kind of poke the bear a little bit. If that makes sense.
And I think, thank you, Allison. And I think uncompromising also just literally, like, we all compromise too much. Ralph Nader is really good on that topic, which is, Ralph says, the American people will get as little as they are willing to accept. I mean, that's as little as we're willing to accept, that's what we'll get. And he's thinking about things like healthcare and, minimum wage and whatever it might be. And it's something to think about.
And I just want to add in that from the perspective of the children's list, it's all of those things, but takes on a little bit of a different or additional meaning to be uncompromising, because if you described the majority of our children's books just, superficially, anyone who's in the children's business of publishing and bookselling and librarians would say just kind of blank response, like, what are you talking about? You can't, who wants to read a book about a child whose father's depressed? Nobody. Well, we did that because we think the book had great value, this book called The Summer of Diving, and the New York Times named it a best picture book of 2022. So, sometimes our instincts to be truthful, whether, the market, we think the market can bear it, or that, other people are judging it, adversely, whatever, there's a kind of uncompromising sticking to our guns because we think it's the right thing to do. And sometimes we win for that and sometimes we don't, but mostly it's a win.
Chloe is like, all right already, okay.
Well,
No,
can
thank you.
I jump in? I don't work at there. I'm just a writer, but what always hits my mind about Seven Stories Press and its role in the world, and it's real, I think, an honest desire to help make things better or help the world move in a more positive direction, a more human direction. And it's simply this: if you're going to change the world, you have to do something different. You can't keep cranking out what you've always been done and expecting the world to change. And I think my take of Dan and his company is he's out to do that different thing. That's the way it looks to me. I don't know.
I'd like to add one more thing to that, in light of what Lee has just said, that about having to do things differently in order to create any kind of change, that the HarperCollins Union is doing amazing work getting or highlighting the plight of assistants and associates and anyone who isn't on a manager level in publishing. And I think that everyone should donate to their strike fund.
Okay.
There's this idea, really anarchist idea called mutual aid. And I think publishers now at this moment, Cole, like at this historical moment, there's all these mutual aid things coming that for some reason publishers are good at. And I'm thinking of, for example, the Independent Publishers Caucus, which which we were part of starting, which is a group of now just under 100 independent presses that come together in this kind of spirit of mutual aid. I'm thinking of Grove Press starting LitHub, which again, it's like it could have been a very entrepreneurial venture. It's not. And I'm thinking, especially of something called bookshop.org, which if you're not already aware of, it's a good alternative to Amazon. It's called Bookshop, bookshop.org. And every book that you buy on bookshop.org, basically most of the profits goes to support independent booksellers. And what the Rail does, I think, with these things, and the way that the Rail supports young people coming into publishing as writers and as staff. But so there are these kind of, it's fairly new. Like a lot of these things started, either just before the pandemic or after. But this is a really radical idea. We're in a capitalist society where the idea is you don't help anybody, you help yourself. And this is a very contrary idea of mutual aid, and that mutual aid is a better survival instinct than competition. And in fact, it goes back to Darwin. If you read about mutual aid, it goes back, Darwin was very undecided, but Darwin was certainly not as into kind of survival of the fittest or in as much as he was into survival of the fittest, it's kind of like, yeah, and the fittest are the people who work in a community and help each other. Those are the species that survive, actually. So it's a very powerful idea, and it's actually a very, almost a new idea that is operating in an important way right now in publishing, in independent publishing.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Chloe. That was great. And we now will conclude with a reading by Nana-Ama Danquah. I'm so excited to have her here. So Nana-Ama is, I'm sorry, pulling up my notes. Nana-Ama is an author, editor, freelance journalist, ghostwriter, public speaker, actress, and teacher. Her groundbreaking memoir, Willow Weep for Me, A Black Woman's Journey Through Depression, was hailed by the Washington Post as a vividly textured flower of a memoir, one of the finest to come along in years. A native of Ghana, Nana-Ama is the editor of 4 anthologies, and she lives in Southern California. Thank you so much for being here. So excited.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love Dan. I love 7 Stories. Can you hear me okay? Did I unmute? Okay. Dan?
Hi, Nana-Ama.
Hi, can you send me one of those shirts that says no middle ground?
Yeah, we have just a few. We have just a few left, but I think I have to find a medium for you. I will.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I had this crazy idea that I wanted to do an anthology on the Black body, and Dan was very interested in it. And I said, but I want half of the contributors to be white writing about the Black body, because I never hear non-Black voices having conversations about race from that perspective. So I asked a bunch of contributors to write about the Black body, and I thought it'd be interesting, since we're discussing 7 Stories, to read just a little bit out of a couple of the contributors, including myself. The first one is an essay called Hands by Nzinga Clark, who is the daughter of Dr. John Henrik Clark. My last memory of my father was surely one of my first. Knuckles and nails, deep lines on dark skin, a palm extending from the wrist, his hands. Hands are the books of our lives. A close look at a pair of hands could tell you everything you want to know about a person. Our hands are made by the way we use them. For my family, the story and history of our time in America can be collapsed into a conversation about our hands. My father was born on a sharecropping farm, and he would be the first to say that farm labor was what drove him from the South. He wasn't built for it. That, and he wanted to be a writer. So this is the story. I am here because once upon a time, a few hundred years ago, the ancestors who would become my family, who would eventually become me, were brought here to America for our labor, for our strong backs, but mostly for our hands. We've had farming hands, craftsmen's hands, factory hands, and caretaking hands that have raised part of every generation that has grown on American soil. By leaving the fields of rural Georgia for New York City, my father changed the fate of his hands. He came to New York to learn to write, but before he was known as a writer, he spent decades doing whatever work he could find, working as a short order cook, cleaning floors, anything that a willing set of hands could do. He worked hard and long for too little money, right until the moment someone first paid him for the thoughts in his head. By moving north, my father jumped the queue and folded our family's ascent from poverty to the middle class into one lifetime. Rags to riches. The leap from the hands' labor to the minds is a Horatio Alger myth that fuels every poor person and every immigrant. It's the story that keeps this country moving forward. So then the next is David Goldsmith. The piece is called, I'm just going to read a small portion of it. It's called The Meaning of Ashy. We meet at a party of a mutual friend, a Caucasian man. We all work in the same tight-knit theatrical sphere, so this sort of thing is bound to happen. We are introduced. She smiles at me. It is in this moment at this party, upon seeing that smile, that I remember I've met her before. There's an instant chemistry between us that catches us both by surprise, an ease she has with me and with my then 6-year-old daughter. She and I bond quickly. Within a week, we are dating exclusively. Within 2 weeks, we are in love. I don't know much about her at this point. There's a brother, or is it a sister? Her parents are still alive, or are they? San Francisco, San Diego. Some story about being left in a steamer trunk and a dog named, no, wait, a cat. She's amazing in bed. She's easy to be around. She's crazy about me. And though I'm unwilling to acknowledge it, there is this: she's Black. How cool is that? Or more to the point, how cool am I? We are at another party, our first together as a couple. A friend of mine, an African-American woman, has rented a dance hall for her birthday. Chic, multiculti guests are playing conga drums in several adjoining rooms. Others dance sensuously to the piped-in music. Still more specimens of fabulousness mill around the full bar in the middle of the main room. I enter hand in hand with my princess. The reaction is not quite that movie cliche, the sound of a needle scraping off the edge of vinyl, accompanied by a room of slack-jawed stares. But that's how it feels, as if all assembled have stopped their merrymaking to take stock of the svelte, statuesque Black woman with the short Jewish man. Think Naomi Campbell on the improbable arm of Jon Stewart, and then have just as quickly gone back to their drinks and to their conversation and their dancing. And as we circulate ourselves into the bloodstream of this party, I can't deny the power I am feeling. It is intoxicating, and I do not need a drink. I shake hands with friends of friends, am introduced to those I've not met before, as though I am a visiting dignitary. And a thought flashes through my mind: everyone at this party must think I have a big dick. Even as I recognize this thought is intellectually absurd, I cannot resist the feeling of empowerment that washes over me. Thank God my new girlfriend is graciously wearing flats so that I don't look ridiculous. I whisper into her ear, everyone at this party thinks I have the biggest dick in the room. That's because you do, Daddy, she responds without missing a beat. I'm ready to marry this girl. We've been dating a month. And then I'm just gonna finish with mine. Just a little. I wrote this piece, it's called Break Skin, Break Spirit, about my daughter who experienced some racism, bullying in her school that made her start cutting and kind of start falling apart. And so anyway, we went through a difficult spell. And I say, 3 years later, as I watched Karama, my daughter, walking in her tea-length white dress through Miss Charlotte's garden to receive her high school diploma, I couldn't help but exhale a sigh of relief. She was graduating cum laude as the vice head of the school, had been lauded with various awards and honors, and she was on her way to an Ivy League college. Despite all the obstacles, Karama had made it. My daughter had made it. But how many other Black children, I wondered, had not? Karama had, in fact, stopped cutting, but I remembered the days when I thought she might kill herself. It made me wonder if other Black children had used sharp instruments to do more than break skin. How often can your spirit be broken until it's beyond repair? The month before Karama's graduation, an 11-year-old boy from Georgia committed suicide because he couldn't deal with the bullying anymore. A couple of weeks before that, an 11-year-old boy in Massachusetts committed suicide, also as a result of bullying from his classmates. We've all heard of the proverbial straw, the one that breaks the camel's back. When I tell white people about Karama's experiences with racism and with bullying, I like to start from the very beginning, from the first word that was spoken by that ignorant neighbor. I like to explain it all step by step, because I don't think a lot of white people are aware of the hurtful and compromising positions into which Black people in America are placed every single day. I don't think a lot of white people understand how truly remarkable and oftentimes miraculous Black survival is, Black success is. Usually I find that I am right. They are not aware. They do not know. But when I tell Black people about Karama's experiences, they nod knowingly. They finish my sentences. It's a story they've heard before, a story they've lived themselves. They have their own version of a similar narrative, a different town, a different decade, a different destructive habit to deal with the intense emotional pain, always going back home, whether it's moving up north or down south, with grandparents or to another school district in order to make it stop, to start fresh someplace else. There's not one person I know, a friend of mine said, who hasn't been through that. I think every one of us from Ruby Bridges on has had to deal with it in some way. Maybe that's the price of the ticket, you know? So it's the Black
Thank
box.
you so much. Thank you so much, Nana-Ama. That was just perfect wrap up to a really wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you all. Allison, Ruth, Dan, Lee, Alex, and again, Nana-Ama. Just really good thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Cole,
Cole.
and thank you, Eleanor and Chloe. Thanks to the rail.
Yeah, thank you, Cole and Eleanor, everybody. It was really fun.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Amazing.
Nana-Ama, this is what I have to do to see you.
Well, you know, you could always Zoom. You could call me.
I'm gonna come see you in person.
Okay.
Thank
I'd
you,
like
thank you,
that.
thank
Amazing.
Bye.
Thank you for inviting
Bye,
me.
Everybody. And
I'm happy to be part of this. Thank you very much for inviting
Thank
me.
you, Lee. Thank you, Alex.
It was nice
Yeah,
meeting
thank
you
you.
via Zoom, Lee.
Thank you, Allison, Alex,
survived it.
and Lee. And thanks to the Terra Foundation for supporting the NSE program, where they support our daily programming and our growing archive. And you can support the Brooklyn Rail via a link that's going to be shared in the chat to help us continue our work, providing platform for the arts, culture, and politics in our publication and events. And just a huge thank you again to Cole and Lee and Ruth and Alex and Dan and Allison and Nana-Ama. Again, thank you for sharing. Thanks everyone who read today. Thank you for the great questions. And if you're free tomorrow, join us for a conversation with Robert Storr, Fong Lee, and Douglas Dreischboon on the event of Robert Storr's exhibition proposals at Kingfish Gallery. And we'll have a reading tomorrow by Samuel Breslin. And now you can turn on your microphones and everyone say hello and goodbye as you head off into the day. Thank you all again. It's been so great, so special.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
And-
great day.